right, girls, it's Dr. Oz again, and I'm going to finish off our topic 5 on plants with a quick look at reproduction. There's a couple things that we're going to cover here on reproduction. First is going to be the structure. What exactly are flowering plants made of? What are the parts? And the second part will be reproduction. What happens when pollination occurs inside of a plant. So those are kind of the two things that we're going to focus on as we move through this last section here. Now, in a plant like this, we call this a flowering plant, but we call it a perfect flower. And the reason we call it a perfect flower is because it has both the male, this is the male reproductive part right here and here, and a female reproductive part right here on the same flower. So if we're looking at this flower, this is the same thing, so it's also a perfect flower. Female, and then the male reproductive parts. Right? So that's going to be the first thing that we'll look at, structure, in a second. And then the second thing that we're going to look at is the reproductive piece. What causes the flowering to occur? And what we're going to see is that any flowering is going to have some sort of change in the gene expression. And that change in gene expression is going to occur here in the shoot apical meristem here. That's where that's going to take place right here. It's the gene expression that causes the flower to develop, right? Without it, we would not get this flower at the very end of our process. So take a look at that. And just like anything else, we have different hormones that are being expressed at different times. And we'll also look at, as far as, the gene expression goes, what is happening. We look at the winter time here, where buds start to form. We see those. We see the breakdown and then the pick back up in springtime. Summertime, we come back down again. So a lot of it, in addition to the hormones, also has to do with the amount of light that is either present or not present, right? Flowers that are going to, or plants that are going to flower in the summer, the reason they do is because there's a shorter window of nighttime, and plants that'll flower here in autumn will flower because there's a longer window of nighttime, so darkness. So in a lot of cases, it's technically not really the light that's going to develop the flower, but it's the darkness and the amount of time in darkness that we're going to see does the actual development. Now here's the first part here, our diagram. And this is an important diagram. This is pieces that you will have to be able to draw, because this is drawing, of course, is one of our command terms, and the flower, just like this, is one of the IB. They'll ask you to draw an animal pollinated flower, and you would have to have all these pieces shown here. So here is the female reproductive organ, right? Sticky stigma, so the pollen can attach easily. The style, and then the ovary, where the pollen is going to develop into a seed. And then, usually you'll have kind of a greenish, what we call sepals, that give way to the petals of the flower. The petals are really there, as an attraction. They're there to kind of guide the insect or the bat or the bird, whatever it happens to be, toward the male reproductive organs, which you see here, stamen. And what they will do is at the end here of the stamen, you have what's called the anther, and there's pollen, tiny particles of pollen on the ends here. That's the filament. And the petals here, like I said, guide the bats or birds, whatever it happens to be, in toward the male anther so it can pick up pollen on its leg or underbelly or whatever it happens to be. And one of the ways that we have pollination is then those birds will go to another flower and they will transfer the pollen. And that's where we get the different genetic diversity that happens. Here's just another look. And I've made up a kind of a study guide for you that has all of these parts of the flower and their what each structure does, and that would be something that you should definitely take a look at. So, this is just another look at the male and the female petals, sepals, and so on. And, gives you an idea of what exactly each of these parts do. And we'll leave that for you to take a look at because those, again, will be important parts to this particular chapter end. This just, kind of explains, what I mentioned before, how the plant has a certain rhythm about it, and what we call this rhythm is what's called photoperiodism, and that's all that is that a plant will flower at certain times based on the length of the day. So what we call long day plants flower in the summer because the nights are short. And short day plants are going to flower in the fall when the nights start to get longer. And the reason for that is we see the gibberellic acid here that gets produced, and that kind of puts us into a routine as far as the flower goes. Now, plants in greenhouses like this, you wonder, well, how can we get plants to flower year-round? Well, they're forced into flowering, and growers will do this in greenhouses where they can manipulate the amount of light that a plant is going to get and kind of fool it into flowering. All right, so the structures are the kind of the first part of this particular chapter. And then the second part looks at pollination, right? We have to be able to transfer the pollen from the anther of the male organ into or onto really the sticky stigma, and then it'll move down into the ovary where it will develop into a seed. And this could happen several different ways. It can be wind that's going to transfer pollen from one flower to another. It can be a bee, it could be a bat, it could be a bird. All these things will come into play. Here's a nice bee and transferring. Bees are our big pollinators. That's why they're at the top of many food chains. They're what we call a keynote species, which means that without the bee, the rest of the food chain starts to collapse because they are such great pollinators. So when we look at so many of our fruits and things are here because they have come from the process of pollination. So it doesn't matter, like I said, if we're talking about bees, bats, insects, birds, hummingbirds, for example, what they're going to do is transfer, right? They come into the flower looking for nectar. So this is very much a mutualistic relationship, right? The bee or bird or whatever happens to be comes in for food, and while they're getting their food, the pollen gets on their legs, their underbelly, their wings, whatever, and then they move to the next flower and they transfer that to and that's why the stigma is sticky, so that pollen will attach to it. All right. Once in the ovary, then, and remember, this is a complete diploid organism, the ovule here, and it's going to develop into a seed. And that seed then germinates, and from that we get the plant and then ultimately the flower. So that's what the fertilization happens, right? The pollen gets transferred to the sticky stamen, moves down into the ovary, where it's going to develop and it's completely diploid, right? The egg is haploid, the pollen, sperm is haploid, but pollination occurs, fertilization here, and we end up with our diploid zygote. That seed continues to develop, right? Germinates, creates the plant, and then the flower. That's our whole process of fertilization. So that's kind of part 2 of this particular unit. This is another command term, draw, is the actual structures of the seed. When we look at these 3 pieces here, the radical comes from the root, shoot over here, the epicotyl, and then the hypocotyl. So these 5 things would have to be included in a drawing. Now, if they say draw, all you need is this. If they say outline parts, then you'd have to know, right? Radical, like I said, root, shoot, stem. Those are kind of the 3 big pieces of the seed. Seed dispersal, as I mentioned, we looked at insects, but of course, remember that wind plays a big part too. The wind, you see this dandelion here, and we see all these individual things are pollen or seeds that will take root on another plant. So seeds get carried by the wind to other places. That's why with dandelions, once you start seeing these on lawns, if you don't take care of them and get rid of them, they'll take over the whole patch of grass. So you have to, kind of watch those. Just a look here. Here's our seed, and we see a pea here, and it begins to germinate. Now, of course, with germination, you got to have water, you got to have oxygen gas, got to be warm enough. And those are really the pieces that you need. This happens to be a pea. And those are, peas are very easy to germinate and get moving. And again, we're looking at seed production here. Gibberellin is the hormone that we're talking about that gets produced in that particular seed. And if you remember from day before yesterday, it produces sucrose, the sugar, which is the energy source for that plant to grow.